and welcome to today's A-Team Group webinar on data standards and global identifiers. My name's Sarah Ann Underwood, and I'm an editor here at A-Team Group, and I'll be moderating the webinar. Our expert speakers today are Ali Harris, Vice President, Data Analytics and Technology at Scotiabank, Amy Kabir, Managing Director, Party Reference Data Operations at JP Morgan Chase, and Nate Dahm, Director, Content Strategy, Real-Time Feeds at ICE Data Services. I'll ask them all to introduce themselves in a few moments, but first, just some information how you can take part in today's webinar. To the right of your video screen, you'll see a Slido section with two panels. There's one for poll questions, and we'll be running 3 poll questions today, so do please take part. It's always useful to find out what you're thinking as we are talking. And then also to the right of that, there's a Q&A panel. And in that, please post any questions for our speakers. Please post them as often as you like, when you like. We'll take them through the Q&A to make sure that we get to as many as possible. I'll let you know when those are coming up, particularly the poll questions. And enough of me, and let's get over to our speakers now. So Ali, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your interest here.
Hi, I'm Ali Harris. I work with Scotiabank as the VP of Data Analytics and Technology. I'm very interested in financial standards, and I'm head of delegation for Canada for ISO TC 68, which is financial standards. Favorite standards include the legal entity identifier, and I'm currently working with another international group on natural persons identifiers as well.
Thank you very much
indeed.
Thank you
so much for inviting me.
Pleasure to have you here. Amy, over to you.
Hi, I'm Amy Cabia. I'm a Managing Director at JP Morgan Chase. I'm responsible for all of our wholesale client reference data. My team is responsible for cross-referencing our internal records to vendor data sets. So I'm a big proponent of the legal entity identifier that Ali mentioned. I'm actually such a proponent that I'm on the GLIFE board of directors and spend quite a bit of my time thinking about how we can increase adoption of LEI.
Excellent, thank you. And Nate, over to you.
Thanks. Nate Dahm from ICE Data Services. I work in our consolidated feed division. Have a high interest in global identifiers, less from the entity level, more at the individual instrument level, as our products are part and parcel to a trading use case, and it's all about the instrument level for me. So the more normalized a feed we can give, the easier it is for our clients to ingest, and that's why I have interest in standards and identifiers. Thanks for inviting today.
Indeed, pleasure to have you here. Thank you all very much indeed. And let's start with the questions. And Ali, coming first to you and setting the scene. How would you describe the scope of data standards and global identifiers in capital markets at the moment?
So I'm glad you mentioned capital markets, because of course, post 2008, that is where most identifiers have been raised. The need there was highest, and there's certainly some regulations and nascent additional regulations coming out. Where I think we've done a relatively good job is in the area of client identifiers, and we, Amy and I both mentioned the legal entity identifier, and that was a direct response to my favorite quote, which is, how many ways are there to spell Lehman Brothers? And it turns out there were quite a few. The legal entity identifier does help that. We're starting to move forward into product identifiers, but that's early days. The unique product identifiers primarily for OTC derivatives at this time. And then I think there's additional identifiers on the personal side, on the wealth side, that both need to come to the table. So I think we're starting to get coverage. It's still very much in the OTC derivatives and the client identification. And I would simply caution that the last crisis is not likely to be the next crisis. So we may be closing some avenues there, but I think there's other areas that we can focus on now.
Thank you. Nate, what would you say there in terms of the scope?
Yeah, the scope for me is, as I mentioned in my introduction, very much at the individual instrument level, to facilitate trading use cases, portfolio marking, this type of activity. When we're looking at identifiers at the instrument level, I kind of think of it in kind of 3 buckets. there are ANA numbers, so your ISINs, your CEDOLs, your QSIPs, right? Both at the global level and the individual marketplace level. There's exchange identifiers, so exchanges have their own schemes beyond the local numbering agencies, using tickers, trading codes, symbol indexes. And then of course we have vendor symbologies. So, whether it be ICE with our consolidated feed symbology or Bloomberg with the Figgies, Refinitiv with RICS, firms have to manage against these three buckets to uniquely identify instruments. And of course, when you're developing an identifier, it's not just the identifier itself, but you have to have supporting data facts to go along with it to describe what that identifier is. So when I'm thinking of identifiers, it's not just the identifier itself, but also the data fields that support it, like the MIC codes that define the marketplace, like the trading currency that the instrument is quoting and trading in. You need a name for the security. I think Amy mentioned Lehman Brothers previously, right? Having standards for all these types of fields that support the identifiers is also important. So I think of it as a holistic proposition.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Let's run an audience poll question. So if you turn to your panel, a poll should have appeared. And the question is, beyond compliance, to what extent has your organization implemented data standards and identifiers? Well, while you answer that question, let me come back to Nate to tell us a little bit about how ICE views the sort of extent to which standards and identifiers have been deployed on a geographic firm size and firm type basis, because obviously this is quite tricky for multi-jurisdictional firms.
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit on the firm's scope and whether they're just strictly a local firm or if they have global reach. Local firms are probably going to tie into identifiers, again, instrument level identifiers from those local marketplaces as a standard, whereas your global firms like your Scotias and your JP Morgans are probably going to be tying in to the larger global initiatives like an ISIN, CEDOL, all the vendor symbologies, et cetera. I think that we find that small firms tend to have a more focused scope, choosing maybe one or two identifiers, whereas the broad firms tend to take the entire buffet, if you will, of symbologies. It's I think that some of the local ones are becoming less utilized as the global ones like ISINs become more of a de facto standard, especially after initiatives like MiFID II, which really solidified ISINs as the primary identifier in the European marketplace.
Excellent, thank you. Let me see, could we see actually the poll results, please? And Nate, perhaps you'd like to comment on these as you've been speaking about this. So beyond compliance, this looks pretty good to me, that quite a lot of people are thinking beyond compliance. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, the moderate extent, I think it's a lot of standards are evolving. 10 years ago, Bloomberg's Figgy wasn't really on the map, and now it's we find that a lot of people a lot of firms like to use that one. So it's evolving. So I'm not surprised that it says a moderate extent at the top, and to a large extent. And again, it come down to firm size.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for voting. And let me bring you in here, Amy, and please tell us a little bit about what are the regulatory use cases of standards and identifiers, and how is this developing?
Thanks, Sarah. I wanted to just comment on something Nate said, like the larger the organization, the more identifiers you are cross-referencing to, and that is definitely true for us. We try to leverage as many vendor data sets as we can, so we do have matching algorithms that we run to cross-reference JP Morgan records to all of the vendors, and having that, once you cross-reference the identifiers, you then have that linkage you can rely on to source data, enrich data, et cetera. But that said, back to the question, the regulatory development, I would actually like to see more regulatory development. MiFID II, which went live January of 2018, really put LEI, on the map. That is when firms rushed to get LEIs because they would not be able to trade derivatives in Europe if they didn't have the LEI. It's regulations like that that drive adoption. When a regulator says you cannot do something that you want to do you will go get that LEI. And I always use the analogy of a passport. If I could travel internationally without a passport, I would not get one. I have no personal need for one. So there needs to be some stick or carrot that says, you can't do what you want to do, or you can't do this new thing that you might be able to do if you don't have this identifier. So I personally would like to see the regulators come out stronger in requiring LEI. What we've seen, derivatives is sort of the leading product where LEI is mandatory, and that's Europe, India, Mexico, Singapore, Hong Kong. But we're starting to see it emerge in equity and fixed income securities. We are also starting to see LEI mandated in the payment space. India was the first country to come out and mandate LEI for large value payments. Additionally, the Bank of England has been vocal in promoting LEI in payments, but hasn't come to mandating it yet. Initially, it was going to be 2023, and then I was hearing 2024. So that's on the horizon. In the meantime, there are a lot of regulations specifically around reporting financial exposures that say, if you have an LEI, please include, if you're reporting exposures and your client has an LEI, it's mandatory to include it. But that if your client has an LEI, it really doesn't drive adoption. It really goes back to, I'd like to see the regulators saying you cannot do this activity unless you have your LEI. However, the regulators are concerned about looking as though they're prohibiting commerce. And so that's why they're very cautious, or some of the regulators are more cautious about putting out these mandates. I guess I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Sarah.
Okay. Nate, how do you see that in terms of sort of the regulatory use cases?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Amy's points about regulation driving standards adoption as something that we probably want to see more of. I mean, you look at a space like cryptocurrencies, right? And there's not a lot of regulation in this space. What's the identifier for Bitcoin? Is it XBT or is it BTC? People talk about things in different ways, and until that regulatory umbrella comes in, it can be a little bit of the Wild West on how people approach the data problems, and these inconsistencies can lead to bad trades and money lost and this type of thing. So I see it as a positive.
Okay.
More is better.
Yeah, I think we'd all agree on that. Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. And coming back to you, Ali, what are the data management benefits of the data standards and identifiers in play in capital markets?
So, of course, in addition to being able to accurately and timely respond to your regulatory reporting needs, just as Amy mentioned, the more identifiers you have in your data set, the more likely you are to make matches, the more likely the data then is to flow through your internal systems. And that means everything from the trading system to your where the reporting is coming out of, to your compliance folks, to your audit folks. It allows for the interoperability within your four walls, never mind without. And I think there's a grand case to be made. I absolutely agree, regulators to regulate, but utilizing and bringing these into your own shop and system have massive benefits just for your operational effectiveness, productivity, and efficiency in general. And so the more identifiers that you do have in your shop, the more likely you are to have semantic interoperability as you're moving forward into other things like knowledge graphs, where you can see connections through all of those identifiers, where you may miss it with just one, or one that does not have global coverage because, if you're not in Europe, maybe you don't get an LEI. So there's other reasons for other identifiers. I think when you look at the internal identifiers match to external identifiers, which we started, I think, as an industry doing a lot of that post 2008 when the LEI came out, And now Amy was mentioning the algorithms. I think we've all built those so that these identifiers now smoothly come in and out of our world. And I've seen a great uplift through that.
Okay. Where do you see the benefits, Amy?
2 points I want to share. One is data quality, and then the second is simplifying compliance with regulatory exercises. On data quality, what I've learned over the years in this space, in working in reference data, is reference data is often manipulated by people in the business to as a workaround to downstream system constraints. It's much easier to just manipulate the data than to go make a coding change. So the data gets manipulated, and then people complain that like the reference data is not good. The benefit, like one of the benefits for us bringing in the LEI was, we had to start tagging our client records with LEIs. Well, as we started doing this tagging, it made it very clear which records were true legal entities and which records were actually kind of like an account, or some kind of segregation of activity that our business, the traders needed, or maybe they were doing it for client preference. All probably very good reasons, but there was a lot of manipulation of the data. Tagging with LEIs, forced us to sort of say these records are true legal entities and these records are not. So that sort of it forced us, I would say, to be more precise with our own data quality. The second is simplifying regulatory exercises. So once we had tagged all of our records with all the records that had registered for an LEI, then the next regulation that came along in 2018-19 was, in the US anyway, was qualifying financial contracts. And our clients had to adhere to protocol that would uplift their derivative contracts and some of their securities contracts to the new standard. So we then had to source, and I'm sure every other bank on the street had to source client adherence. Having the LEI on those client records made it very easy to source client adherence and just seamlessly, and I see Allie, she knows exactly what I'm talking about, seamlessly bring in that client adherence, because they would post it, the client would post their adherence using their LEI on, ISDA.org, and then we could seamlessly append that to the JP Morgan record. So we first had that experience with QFC. Then after that, it was LIBOR fallback protocol. Then after that, it was SBS adherence protocol. There's probably others that I'm not thinking of. We're using it in the non-cleared margin rules for phase 5 and 6, where we create regulatory groups using LEIs. So there's just been so much benefit on the regulatory compliance that is why I feel so strongly that I'd love to have an LEI for every organization that is in our database.
Okay, that's great. Let's take another poll question and see what our audience is thinking about this time the data management challenges of implementing data standards and identifiers. So we've talked about what the benefits are. So where are the challenges for implementing data standards and identifiers at your organization? You can click as many options as you like that are appropriate to your organization. And while you do that, let me come back to Amy to her views on the challenges here and perhaps a little bit on the solutions.
So challenges, I would say no matching algorithm is perfect. And no vendor data set is perfect either. So we as practitioners have to always be cautious about cross-referencing to vendor sets, and acknowledge that there's no perfection in data. I think I think about the challenges with identifiers. That's the first one, is just being, I guess, judicious and ensuring that you have some operational oversight. What I've learned with working with AI algorithms The machine will tell you, yes, definitely a match, or no, definitely not a match. But there's a gray area where the machine says, I cannot decision this, and it has to go to an ops team. So I think it's important that you do have operational oversight of these matching algorithms. And especially when you're using the data for financial reporting or regulatory reporting of any sort. There are, we get into like, oh, well, I'm just doing sales prospecting. Okay, maybe your data doesn't need to be as perfect, and perhaps you don't need that oversight of the algorithms. But when it comes to financial reporting, definitely having operational oversight is important.
Okay, thank you. Nate, what would you say from your perspective, perhaps in the more instrument level?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, this topic keeps me very, very busy in the day-to-day activities of my job. Just like with development teams that manage software, data management teams have to worry about change control with their data, right? I agree with everything that Amy said about quality processes and operational oversight. Of course, we all want to automate as much as possible, but having a team actually review the results is super important. With respect to change control, probably the number one area we spend time on is application of corporate actions. So coverage is obviously important. You pick a market and you get your identifier coverage to 99.9%, but that has to be maintained. And one of the biggest challenges that firms find is that maintaining the linkage through corporate actions, because identifiers will change. If there's a reverse stock split or a name change and the ANA number changes, or the exchange ticker changes, or any of them change, you not only have to manage that change in advance of the trading day so that firms have their instrument universes completely up to date and can trade, but you also have to manage access to the previous history, price history of that, so that you can have correct charts adjusted for price adjusted for splits and spinoffs and all the weird and wonderful corporate actions there are. So we kind of have a philosophy of, well, there's 3 steps to corporate action processing: data collection, data application, data verification. So there's always going to be teams collecting it. You want to have as much automated application as possible, but this data is super sensitive. I mean, if you missed the split for Amazon, your phones are going to be ringing, and your clients are not going to be happy with you, right? It affects both the cash equities and then all the derivatives that flow off those instruments as well. So yeah, it's something that you can apply a lot of machine learning and automation to, but you've always got to have that operational team behind it to do the data verification at the end of the life cycle.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And can we see the poll results, please? Amy, perhaps you'd like to comment on this. This is the problems of our audience. These come up quite often in our webinars, as you can imagine. What would you say?
Oh, yes. And I'm seeing that the key word here is implementing. And I just realized when I answered the question, I was thinking more about using the data rather than implementing. Absolutely, legacy systems is a challenge with implementing new identifiers. We've been working with our payments business to implement LEI, and it's it's slow going. And data silos, same thing. Where parts of the business are not able to rely on or haven't historically relied on central systems of record, they kind of built their own little data factories, and it's harder to get the uptake in those sort of localized data stores. So I think our participants maybe they work at JP Morgan. They reflect exactly the same challenges that we see here.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for voting, everybody. And let's take another break and take some audience questions at the same time. We have quite a few coming in here. I'm going to come back to you, Amy. It's an LEI question. It says, LEIs are a great way to get uniqueness and standardization of legal entities. Do you think we can ever get the same uniqueness and standardization achieved for listed security identifiers? Perhaps Amy could start, and then Nate, you might want to pick up on that.
For listed security identifiers, yeah, I would probably ask for Nate's help here, because I would have thought that CUSIP ISIN would be the thing, but maybe there's referring to something else.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll go back to the three buckets I mentioned. There's ANA level identifiers, exchange level identifiers, and vendor symbologies, right? In the kind of the three buckets at the instrument level. There's hope for, and there is standardization at the ANA level, because these organizations, CUSIP and CETL do a reasonable job of applying identifiers to large portions of the listed instrument universe. Certainly good in cash equities. With MiFID II, ISIN numbers are more common on derivatives now as well. Maybe that will expand globally, other than just Europe. At the kind of exchange level, those are always going to be local. Unless somebody conglomerates all the exchanges globally, that'll never happen, right? So every exchange is going to have their own view on what their ticker, their local ticker, should look like based on their own local standards. And then vendors, of course, vendors, it's an evolving marketplace. Speaking for ICE, of course, we're always looking to apply better and more standards, and we'll be applying those standards in perpetuity to continue to make our data model and our identifiers more and more consistent over time.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in from just
Sure.
there are legacy systems that we and silos that we have to face. There's also legacy identifiers, and what got us here won't necessarily get us there. And I'd like to just talk a little bit, like when the CUSIP came out, there were literally small children running through the streets with pieces of paper. And the CUSIP was a fantastic idea and solved that problem quite nicely when we were looking at names to names. As we've moved forward, and some of the principles of a good identifier work that ISO has done is, let's not embed intelligence. Let's not have, some of the pieces that original identifiers had, because they were being looked at more by humans than they were by machines. But it's a different time. So now we have things like the checksum on the LEI or the NPI or the UPI, because it's something that's machine readable. So just to say that as much as we have legacy systems, sometimes we have legacy identifiers, and not all of them have exactly what we would want if we were designing them today for a machine readable environment.
Okay. Yeah, you're absolutely right there. Yeah.
I would like to add on to that as well. Coming back to something that Nate said, exchange level will always have their, I think Nate, you used the word local ID. I use the term native ID. And it's the same thing with LEI. That is a global identifier, globally accepted identifier, but every vendor has their native ID for a counterparty. Every bank, JP Morgan, Scotiabank, et cetera, has their native ID. So that's why this cross-referencing of identifiers is so important, because we'll never live in a world where we don't have native identifiers.
That's right.
So I just wanted to say counterparty identifier, same thing as instrument in that way.
Okay. Coming back to you, Ali, with one which sort of rather follows on from there, it says, aren't the costs of licensing of identifiers a big issue, hindering people to use a standard identifier, and a reason why people use so many different identifiers? I think you've kind of half answered that they will always do that, but is there a cost issue?
Well, when I think about, again, my favorite identifier, the LEI, one of the principles that we worked under is that it had to be free for the public good. So I know, and Amy can steer me right here. So, but there are, I believe it's twice daily files from the Glyph that are available to just bring down the entirety of that. Now, I do understand that there will be, and certainly from some of the data vendors, there's absolutely a cost for doing that work, that exception queue that we have within. They certainly have there in their shops, and they can talk about that as well. But I would say, at least on the international front, there is a view that all standards must be available, either low cost to no cost, to make sure that it is accessible. And that, as we move forward into things like the natural persons identifier, we're working under the same principles, where we do not want the cost of an identifier to be a barrier to playing in these financial services and economic forums. So I think that's definitely changing. I think the work that all of our data vendors do is super important and worth it, but they're taking on the cost of pulling those things together that perhaps smaller firms cannot do, and larger firms probably have entire departments that do it.
Okay, fine. Back to you, Amy, with another one. It says, and I think you know the answer to this, is the trend to decrease multi-sourcing of reference data to adhere to cost savings, or do you feel multi-sourcing reference data is going to increase to include more sources?
Yeah, multi-sourcing, as you could guess. Yeah, I think because there's inherently going to be imperfection in data, the more sources you can use and triangulate, I think the better quality that an organization can achieve. And I'm a strong believer in the challenge mechanism. So the LAI registry has a challenge mechanism. It's almost sort of like a crowdsourcing, if you see something, say something. That's yeah, I mean, I think data is sort of like trying to keep your data perfectly clean is like trying to keep your house perfectly clean. You're always going to focus on the most visible areas, like the things that your sales and trading organization are complaining about. But then there's going to be like those corners that like you didn't get to because it wasn't as critical at that time. And then something pops up and that little corner becomes extremely critical, and you focus on it. So I just think that's the reason multi-sourcing is important, because no source will be perfect.
Okay, fine. Nate, I'm going to come back to you this one. It's more common than a question, and it's on costing, and it says that CDOL QSIPs are some examples are very expensive to use. Is that the case, and does that mean people are less enthusiastic to use them?
We don't find that people are less enthusiastic to use them. They are costly, no doubt, but they're also de facto standards for many markets, and you almost for certain, it's almost a cost of entry to even be able to play. Now, I think that I like some of the previous comments that I think the world is. I agree, the world is evolving towards more of a cost-free mechanism as a principle, and I think that we'll, there's competition within identifier schemes too, right? And perhaps over time, firms will, as they adopt more of them, perhaps more clients will go to the cost-free ones for exactly this reason. But that remains to be seen. I mean, QSIP is very, very embedded in the US, and CDOL is very, very embedded in the UK.
Yeah. Takes time, but we've seen the LAI go quite a long way. It's something I've covered for all these years, since 2012 when I first issued. Isn't that awful? Never mind that. And okay, we've got a lot of questions today, so let me come back to you, Alia, if I may. And this one says, it can be difficult to win budget and resources to deploy data standards and identifiers beyond those required for compliance. How would the panel approach management buy-in?
So the first thought I had is it can be more expensive not to. When you think about bringing counterparty data together for reporting purposes, if you're thinking about, my world in compliance, so straight out of the gate, I think about cost reduction, cost aversion, and that means ensuring that we're always doing the right thing, not simply to avoid fines and penalties, but because it is the right thing. So I would say when I go to management and talk about embedding data standards, I speak about interoperability. I speak about future proofing. So standards are a way to identify things in the real world semantically that ties in very well to some of the future proof type of work that we're doing with artificial intelligence, machine learning, knowledge graphs, and semantics. And then finally, I just speak about the operational efficiency. So we just talked about how even with identifiers, there is a portion where you may have an exception queue and need people to look at it rather than machines. But standardization lowers that cost exponentially by the implementation of a good identifier, no matter where that is, and reference data. So it's usually a combination of cost reduction, cost avoidance, and future-proofing your organization to do some of the cool things you want to do in the future.
Okay, that's great.
I'd also add, if I could, I'd
Yeah,
also
sure.
add it's client opportunity. So the data vendor perspective here, if we don't keep up with the latest sets of identifiers, we're going to have access to a smaller client pool because surely someone might say, well, isn't it strange that you're carrying Bloomberg Figgies on the ICE consolidated feed? Well, we have clients that only use Bloomberg Figgies. Are we really not going to sell into them? We want to provide cross-reference solutions to the broadest client base possible. Ultimately, you've got to listen to your clients, and if they're using an identifier, then as a data vendor, you're surely going to want to consider that in your service.
Okay, excellent. I have one which is put to both Nate and Amy, and I'll come to you first with this one, Amy. And it says, can you describe the efforts involved to implement and integrate multiple identifier sources? Do you have entire teams working on developing an internal matching schema? I think you talked about more automation here, but what's it like doing this?
Yeah, it's a combination of technology ops and our AI teams. I mean, I feel so fortunate to be in a large organization that does have AI teams, plural. They even compete against each other. It's like, oh, we're the better AI team. So we have access to those resources. It's just really fantastic. So the implementation is a collaboration among all three teams. So we have to, have I refer to data as you have the container, and then you have content that fills the container. So the tech team needs to create the containers to hold the data, and the ops team needs to populate the container. And we use the matching algorithm to auto-populate where we can. And then, as we've described before, you have an ops team looking at where you don't find a match. And so the ops team ultimately is responsible for oversight of the content and standing behind the cross-referencing. And I think it was Nate who was mentioning corporate actions. You have to make sure you're keeping, there may be a merger of two entities, and so there's a non-surviving LEI. And if you have vendor records linked to that, you have to update those cross-references. So I think, to answer your question on implementation, though, it's the collaboration among those three teams, and we are fortunate here to have many people working on this. And I'm speaking for the counterparty side of the house. We have another team that works on instrument data, and they're doing the exact same thing. So it is an investment. And I think both Nate and Ali gave great responses on how do you convince senior management to invest, because it's not always easy. I think it's like passing an infrastructure bill in government. It's not very exciting to, we need to, improve the roads and bridges. People are like, we could just keep driving on them as they are. And you're like, yeah, but they're going to break down, and it's going to be very, Ali was talking about cost avoidance. It's like, it's going to be very expensive if we wait till it's too late in order to, make this investment. But yes, it does require some resources and the scale. Well, and actually, if you're in a small organization, I think some of the vendors are selling their cross-referencing services. So if I ran a small bank, I would probably be looking at something like that.
Would you add anything to that, Nate, in terms of the effort that has to go in?
Yeah, that was a great answer. So I don't have a ton to add on Amy's perspective there. I'll just note that yes, of course, our organization at ICE has large departments that manage reference data in exactly the way she described, with development, ops, and managing for all those different dimensions that we previously talked about.
Okay, lovely. Here's an interesting question, Ali. I'm going to put it to you, and it's around the LEI. And it says, we'd love to hear the opinion on the Perm ID or the FIGI as an alternative to the LEI for party identification. Is this something that comes up a lot, or is the LEI so big now? Or Nate mentioned the FIGI. What do you see here?
I think the FIGI and the LEI at least are for two pretty different purposes. One being counterparty and the other one being instrument. So there are no replacement. I think the LEI truly, and this may be, and I've been very out loud that the LEI is my favorite standard because it was one of my first in financial services, but I think it's it at this point. I think the legal entity identifier is our best shot at a truly global identifier for counterparties. There's a couple of other places, if I could wave my magic standards wand, where would I utilize the LEI? One, more fully in my procurement. And I would suggest, other organizations, governments could do the same. It's, it doesn't need to be just for trading. We're starting to see it in business registries here in Canada. In BC, the verifiable LEI is available through our business registry. So I don't see the LEI being taken over by anything. I do see it having a lot more applicability. And Amy, you mentioned in the payment space, that's absolutely where we've taken a look at what India's done. I think, the rest of the world is watching that and seeing the opportunities there. The anti-money laundering and fraud folks and my other compliance friends are very excited about the potentials there. So I don't really see anything taking over the LEI. I do say, in the instrument world, there's still a little bit of shakeout because there are, as Nate said, there continues to be some competing standards in that space, and which one will win? That's a little bit of a VHS beta decision at this point as things shake out.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for your questions. We have more than we have time to answer today, so I will collect them up and give them all to Nate, our sponsor, and he can have a look at them. If you'd like to add your names to your questions, he will be able to get back to you. If not, he will just know what you're thinking. So if you'd like to add your names, please do, and I'm sure ICE will make an effort. Best efforts to get back to you. But thank you for all those questions, and thank you to our speakers for answering them all. And let's get back to my questions. And Ali, please, would you talk a little bit about forthcoming data standards and identifiers that data management practitioners should be preparing for?
Yeah, so I think one that I've been relatively involved in is the natural persons identifier. And the natural persons identifier, part one of the ISO standard is complete, which is just the code itself and the underlying reference or metadata. And part two is how you'd actually use it. Lots of applicability, certainly, potentially for payments, but the original use cases were for trader names under MiFID, MiFIR, and protecting the privacy of staff. Also, potential usage in the Corporate Transparency Act both sides of the border in North America to identify beneficial owners. I think that if there's a standards to watch at the moment, that's likely it. And then the unique product identifier, which I mentioned, is currently really only being used in OTC derivatives and swaps and so on. I think that one will also expand into different asset classes and likely to be utilized in Ali reporting.
Okay, Nate, what would you say there? What should people be preparing for?
Yeah, I agree with the unique product identifier that Ali just mentioned. I think that'll be interesting to see how that evolves, and we'll all keep our eye on that space. I'd say any emerging asset class has an opportunity to develop identifier standards. So, we should all keep our eyes on cryptocurrencies. It's, it's in the news a lot, and it's still, it comes and goes with the marketplace. But I think there's a lot of standards yet to be developed in that. It's still, as I mentioned previously, a bit of the Wild West.
Okay, excellent. Thank you both. Let's run a final audience poll question here. I think we just have time. It says, beyond compliance, what extent of business and operational benefits is your organization gaining or would expect to gain from implementing data standards and identifiers? So once again, you can tick as many boxes as are appropriate. And while you do that, let me come to Amy to talk about the business and operational use cases of implementing data standards and identifiers beyond compliance. and the kind of benefits they can deliver. We've talked a little bit about the benefits earlier, but in terms of business use cases, what can we see there?
Yeah, thus far we've talked about the operational use cases and the benefits for data management, and I'll tie this back to trying to sell the investment to senior management. And Nate said, focusing on benefits for the client. And we've been trying to really get at what is it that will help our salespeople with their clients, so that if we can get the salespeople behind our data strategy, that'll be easier to get investment. So it's interesting, like, as what we've learned is the more we can visualize the data for sales, like, number one, get them to trust the quality of the data, and number two, visualize the data so that they can see information about the relationships they have with their clients across the firm. And then they always want to see, oh, well, what am I missing out there? They want to see the potential, so that they can say, oh, well, what if I sell this product or that product, or or can you give me information about who they're executing transactions in this country with, etc. So it's really, I think that by coming back to that point of data quality, if it's a hard thing to do, but to prove out data quality and then have sales and front office trust the data and satisfy their use cases, that's, I think, the future of, like, getting more investment in data. I think senior management across most financial institutions have probably heard people like me, begging for money for years. And so we're trying to, like, I don't know if I should say change tactic, but really focus on those business benefits and partnering with our salespeople to figure out how can we provide value to them, because then they will be advocates for our data strategy.
Okay, lovely. Ali, what would you say there in terms of the sort of business benefits?
Not much to add. That was, I think, a perfect answer. Again, the business benefits of operational efficiency are usually what sells standardization. That's always an interesting conversation to quantify that in person hours. But I think the return of investment for data is starting to be better known, and we've got better ways of quantifying it. So we have those better conversations with our executives as we're looking for the funding.
Excellent, thank you. Please may we see the poll results, and perhaps Amy, you'd like to comment on these as you started on the question. So yep, we identified a lot of operational benefits. Yep, some significant business benefits. What's your thoughts there, Amy?
Yeah, I mean, it's consistent with our view within my team and my organization. One of the things that we can help with the client, we can reduce the cycle time of client onboarding by having better data and leveraging identifiers and vendor sources. So that's something we're actively trying to do now, or actively implementing now, coming back to, like, what does it take to implement, changing systems, client onboarding systems and other downstream systems is a challenge. And I've put many years of effort into trying to make it happen. And this year we're going to, finally see some results of it. But definitely our salespeople care a lot about speed of onboarding. So that is one of the benefits we focus on the most. And then it's really the feedback we've gotten from them is wanting to kind of tie together the data about actual relationships they have with their clients with, prospective opportunities with their clients. So the poll numbers are very consistent with how I view it at JP Morgan.
Excellent, thank you, and thank you all for voting. And staying with you, Amy, could you talk us through a practical example of a firm that is making good use of data standards and identifiers and the kind of outcomes it's seeing?
Yeah, the biggest change I've seen in counterparty reference data in terms of operational processes internally in our processes is the ability to use a matching algorithm to automatically search our database to see if we already have that client or record for that party, whether it's as a client or as an issuer or some other role. And if we already have that record, we don't need to create it again. We can just tag it with a new product. Similarly, the algorithm can say, no, definitely don't have that record yet, and then can automatically create a new record. And then there's that, portion in between where the algorithm can't tell what to do. But that has been a game changer for us for onboarding, especially in the small and medium-sized businesses, where we may already, like our business banking team may already have captured that client, and then they'll come in through a different channel. So instead of creating a duplicate record or having humans, do a search and see if we have that record, these matching algorithms have allowed us to automate that search and automate the party creation. When I say party, I mean record creation. So that's been a real game changer. And additionally, so there's two ways we can automate that record creation. One is with information that's been input by the client, and two is vendor data. So for example, if a client comes in with an LEI, instead of us typing in the name and address, if someone just types in the LEI, we can pre-populate the JP Morgan native record with the glyph data. Similarly, we could do, if they don't have an LEI, we could do a name search, Bloomberg data, BVD data, et cetera. If we can find a record in a vendor population, we can use that to auto create a record. So those are the capabilities that are making our client onboarding process faster.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we haven't got a lot of time left today, so let me come to you, Nate, if I may, and putting everything together, everything we've talked about in the last 40 or so minutes, how would you describe the optimal deployment of data standards and identifiers, and will we ever get there?
Well, certain firms will get there. Will we get it forever? I don't know. So I'll say maybe 4 dimensions to an optimal deployment. One that's broad, right? We talked about lots of different, making sure that you have a broad scope of identifiers that are supported. Don't be narrow, go broad. Number 2, make sure you have supporting referential data fields like MIC, currency, asset type, names, so that you can describe the identifiers very efficiently. Make sure you're clear on what they are. Have efficient data management tools. So we can automate as much as we want, but ultimately we want our operations teams to be able to look at the data, to QA coverage, quality, manage corporate actions, et cetera. And finally, one that we didn't touch on yet, but I think is also important, is thorough documentation. So both for our firms internally and how we deal with our clients, it's really important to have thoughtful definitions for our identifiers and our standards, and be very clear and transparent on what coverage we have of those identifier sets. And the more you can, the more, just like what Ali was saying earlier, the more information you can be from a transparency perspective, make it available in the marketplace, the more efficient everyone will be.
Excellent. And Amy, what would you add to that in terms of the perfect deployment?
Optimal, I think, there's no perfection, but not to forget about maintenance. It's very easy to say, I'm just going to create a bunch of data and then walk away. But data quality is an everyday activity like brushing your teeth. And so defining the maintenance processes before you create data is very important.
Okay, fine. So
yeah, right. It's both about the tools, and then the processes underlying those tools. That touches again on that documentation thing, right? You've got to have, you can have all the tools you want. If you don't have the solid processes behind them, well documented workflows, then you'll get into trouble.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. So finally, let me ask all our speakers for their advice to people for practitioners who are working with data standards and identifiers. Let me begin with you, Nate. What would you suggest?
So be flexible and support multiple schemes again. partner with firms that are supportive of highly normalized data models, not just for identifiers, but for everything. So everything we talk about with identifiers is also applicable to really any aspects of market data that we deal with. And then just make sure you develop your system in such a way that it's extensible. So standards and identifiers are going to evolve. You want to have systems that can adapt to the times, without having to re-architect from the ground up.
Okay, thank you. Amy, what would your advice be?
I feel like I exhausted my my thoughts here. 3 pieces of guidance. I think persistence. It's tough being the data person because data is the easiest thing for people to complain about. So I would say persistence and developing relationships with the people in power. Because sometimes a relationship and a reputation will get you further than a business case that says, here's the, people want an ROI, but it's really hard to come up with, rock solid ROIs on a lot of these data initiatives. So I think building relationships is going to get you a long way in this space. So maybe a sort of a non-standard response, but
that's fine. Culture is also always an issue in all of these things. Yeah, and as you say, looking upwards is as important as looking downwards. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And Ali, some final guidance from you, please.
I'd say bring everyone along with you, and that certainly includes your seniors. Make your identifiers and your data as available and visible as possible. Sunlight is the best disinfectant for clothing and data. And so I think the more widely used it is and the more widely seen that data is, the effective challenge you can have within and without your organization. You will find your data is better, your standards are better. And I would finally say, get involved. If you see a place it's like, wow, we have this internal identifier, it'd be great if there was more interoperability. There's some fantastic standards organizations that you can reach out to jurisdictionally and globally, and we'd certainly be happy for your help.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their experience and their expertise today. Thank you to ICE for sponsoring today's webinar. Before we close, just a few A-Team group items that may be of interest to you. If you scroll down your screen to additional options, you can take a look at A-Team Connect, which is our professional platform that you can use to deliver highly effective and interactive events and webinars. You can also sign up for our March 2023 Data Management Summit in London, which seems some way off, but will no doubt come around fairly quickly. Indeed, I'm already looking forward to that. And finally, you can download the latest edition of our Regulatory Data Handbook. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Ali, Amy, and Nate. And thank you to all of you who've taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.